Hello and welcome to the 1916 Company Podcast. I'm Tim Masso here with Armand Johnston. This will be our last cast of 2024, and before the new year strikes, we are declaring our New Year's resolutions, both for ourselves and for the industry. Armand, why don't you take it away and let us know how this works?
All right. So I picked a few topics, a couple brands that we're going to discuss, a couple of types of brands, and just like a little collector's kind of resolution for myself, and I think for a lot of people out there. So I'll start with the brands. My first brand of discussion is Vacheron Constantin, and I think one thing that I would love for the brand to do is really look into their past catalogs with a fine-tooth comb. Not so much do vintage reissues, but vintage inspiration. Bring some of those, interesting vintage complications, some of those dial layouts, some of those case designs, some of those lugs into the modern world. And, we see that with something like Corne de Vache with the kind of horned lugs. And I think that's fantastic. That watch, is very vintage inspired and is a modern hit. So I would love to see the brand just pay attention to their past a little bit more.
Okay, that I like. And I think that's very consistent with what Vacheron does generally, because even back in the late 80s with Les Historiques, they were the first to bring back reissued classic models on a regular commercial basis. So I do think that might be a New Year's resolution that comes true.
And, I think I choose Vacheron because it's the oldest brand, arguably. So it's one of those, you have so much to pick from, and it's kind of a bit of a trend breaker, I would say, to a certain degree. And I don't mean that vintage reissues are a trend breaker. I mean taking vintage inspiration into the modern realm.
Yeah, I think there is a fine line between respecting your heritage and just rote reissues. And I think Vacheron does a pretty good job of reimagining some of its watches as a composite. For example, the American 1921. The watch that we know as the American 1921 today is actually a composite of two watches made in 1921 and 1919. And that's almost never recognized. What's always said is just that it's the recreation of the 1921, when in fact it's actually an original effort. So I really like that idea. And I think it would also do well for the company to look back into its more recent history. For example, the 1990s. How much would you love to see the Mercator-style hand index time display brought back?
I was just discussing a Mercator with a colleague this morning, actually, the yellow gold version from the 90s, and it's amazing. It's so cool. I adore that watch, and I agree. I think I actually think 90s watchmaking is a lot of fun.
And how about this? How about a Saltarello retrograde minute jump hour in an overseas case?
Whoa.
That'd be fun.
Whoa. I would never have put it in an overseas case, but that is funky. And that kind of is pseudo along the trajectory they're going. We have a retrograde date in overseas now.
Oh, yeah.
And that's that. You know what, Tim? It's like you're in this for a reason.
Yeah, right? It's like I get paid to do this. All right. So I think what I'm going to do, this is a resolution for Tim Masso personally, but I am going to try to expand my vocabulary and scope when discussing movement finishing. I think the last 5 years, both for me and for the watch social media critical community, has been focused on interior angles. And I think everyone who's been on Instagram, everyone who writes articles about these things, everyone who's in the watch social media space or critical journalism is really over-focused, I think, on these like interior creased angles. And I'm not saying they require any less skill to achieve, just that the industry has changed to the point now where, like almost everything else that becomes popular, ways of producing them in series have been devised. And for the most part, this takes the forms of specialists now, like Nathalie Jean-Louis or Philippe Norbel, others like them, who can basically receive parts from a brand, execute the finish however you like, and ship it back. It's no less skillful, but there is now like a cottage industry developing around interior angles and big bevels. And I do think we need to acknowledge other forms of finishing and the skills that are embodied in those executions. So I'm going to be moving a little bit away from maybe shouting out those angles and those inward bevels when I've got my 30-second review going. I've got to really choose my words carefully, and I think enough has been said about interior bevels. It's time to look at other finishing flourishes that require and deserve respect.
I like that. For a long time, interior angles weren't something that could be, well, easily machined finish. And to your point, I think it's still not the easiest thing to do machine wise or by hand, obviously. But there are, well, to quote you, there are ways to do it in series now. There are kind of steps that brands will take to achieve that finish.
And I also think that the nuance is kind of lost when you just say yes or no interior angles, because I can tell you from endless experience that even when interior angles are formed, there's definitely a difference between the kind of interior angle you see on a 1970s Patek Philippe 350 automatic, which does have them, and something that is extraordinary, like a Romain Gaultier HMS, where the bevels seem like they're drawn back farther over the bridge than the thickness of the bridge itself. So within the world of interior angles, you have that scale from like, yes, it checks the box, to, oh my God, my eyes are watering. And I think respecting that distinction and making more of it is going to help me become a better critic of finish, and also offer a more valuable perspective to the watch community. This is not a binary yes or no type of litmus test, but degrees of quality still matter even here. So that's one of my personal New Year's resolutions.
Now, rather than focusing on something like interior angles, what type of finish would you like to call out in its stead?
Well, I think there's a really huge range of quality when it comes to things like stripes. If you take something like Jean-Daniel Nicolas, which is Daniel Roth's current brand, he no longer makes the Daniel Roth brand. He makes his own. And the stripes he puts on those movements really look three-dimensional, almost like I'm looking at a hologram. And something like that is surpassing and deserves to be called out. And I think we take Côte de Genève kind of for granted. And if we distinguish between greater and lesser executions, it's generally whether it's some sort of abrasive wheel traditional run or a stamped Côte de Genève. And I want to say that even within the realm of abrasive wheel Côte de Genève, there are degrees of difference. Also, little things like the quality of a screw in a movement. It's easy to polish the top of a screw, and there are mechanical process developed for creating slotted screws and beveled circumference, but when you're looking at something truly hand executed, like a screw from Languntaina, that you're in the presence of excellence. And I would also say that architecture needs to be shouted out more. Like if you look at something like Languntaina's Frederick III, when they first started making manufacture movements at Languntaina, they did what Lange did, which is to create a big, bare, three-quarter style bridge like it's an old pocket watch, which was fine for Lange in the 90s, trying to reconnect with its history, because Lange is a revival brand. But at Languntaina, they came up with this idea of the trigonal bridge, where instead of having this huge monoplate over the drivetrain and the crown wheel and the ratchet wheel, they cut the bridge away to the bare minimum necessary for the crown wheel, the barrel, and the drivetrain, and it created a much more interesting looking movement.
We've discussed movement architecture here and there on this show, on our live show, and it's always interesting to see the kind of difference between the more organic shapes, which I would actually put Langenheine in the kind of organic side of things. It's round, there are points, there's no squared off edges to really speak of. And I think that's interesting in the sense of, form and function. This is art, right? This doesn't necessarily hit in a form or function way. This was a decision made based off of the form and function to bring this shape about. And I think you nailed it with that, actually. Movement architecture is not something that I would have necessarily put on this list, but you absolutely nailed it when you said that, because it is really interesting just thinking about it, separating a bridge, effectively cutting a bridge in thirds in this case, I would say, or a main plate, really just opens the watch up, and it gives the watchmaker a greater opportunity to finish, a greater span of things to finish, and a more open work, more honest viewing of that for the owner.
And I would also say that in terms of what I'm going to look for specifically, is the ratchet wheel double solarized? Is it triple solarized? Are the characters on the bridges and plates cut by a drill or a laser, or are they hand engraved? Take a look at the teeth of the crown wheel. Are they micro beveled? Little things like this go a long way. How are the bridges frosted? Are they frosted by media blasting? Or was a wire brush used to achieve that granular finish? Things like this, in combination, add up to an impressive total. And a truly great finishing execution is going to involve some or all of these, and that's a real difference maker. It means a lot more than just whether you put one gargantuan interior angle at the center of the watch over, like, the balance cock or the center wheel. And I think all of that's really important. Also, things along the lines of, if you have a skeletonized bridge, do you interior bevel the inside of that skeletonized bridge? Like, there are times when it's easy to pull off an interior bevel when you've got a big open bridge with a long run of bevel. But when you have something like the Laurent Ferrier Gallet, or now Classic micro rotor, and you've got that skeletonized balance cock, if it's skeletonized, do you then go inside it, bevel the interior, and create deep cleft bevels inside that structure? Because it's really confined and hard to get in there. And in that case, the component is steel. And if you do, that's a real feather in its cap. Like, how much commitment have you shown? Because there's a big difference between one or two standout pieces of polish or beveling or solarization and a movement that gives you all of the above. Like, that's the difference between, a Lange und Söhne making a really nice watch but making 5,500 of them a year, and Lange und Heine making less than 10% of that. And I know I keep using that as an example, but I really do think they're an exemplar. If you want to look at the best, Romain Gauthier, Lange und Heine, Ferdinand Berthoud, there are still many Grubel 4C watches that are uncompromised. And at the very top of their lineup, de Bethune as well. So really a lot of incredible work being done, and none of them duplicative of the others. So I think originality, probably the last thing I would put on that list for my New Year's resolutions as a watch critic. What's up next on your list? And I realize in the real world, you can only have one resolution. Here, this is more like a Christmas list / New Year's resolution hybrid.
Well, since we're on finishing, I'll bring up my finishing related resolution. Now, I want to preface this with saying I know watches are a business. I do know that. I understand that. I understand these independent watchmakers who pop up do need to make money to keep the lights on and put food on the table. I would love to see a few things. If you're a relatively new independent, have something to say from an horological perspective. We understand finishing. We really appreciate finishing. But I've noticed a bit of a trend in extremely highly finished time-only watches, or effectively time-only, that don't really move the needle forwards, backwards, sideways, left or right, horologically. And I think if you're creating an extremely highly finished time-only or low complication or no complication timepiece, have something to say interesting in the movement, whether that be escapement-wise, whether that be, well, to your point, architecture, but it needs to be something a little bit more interesting than, oh, but this is beautifully finished.
Yeah, I think that the low-hanging fruit of decorating like 6497s and 6498s has probably been picked at this point. It does seem like there are a lot of three-hand independent brand time-only watches using that architecture, and the primary contribution of the brand has been some form of decoration. There's also, it seems, a lot of Habring A11-based movements out there right now at indie brands that are being gilded to the max, but you're still talking about Habring's 7750 conversion with the automatic and the chronograph stripped away to leave the basic drivetrain. So what started as a 7750 is now a time-only manual wind watch, is now a decorated stripped 7750. And I do think at some point you need a new idea, like, Raoul Pages, when he started, he was using the drivetrain of existing movements when he first started making watches. Now, not everyone can build at the level he can construct, but he really stepped into prime time with the régulateur de temps, which was a regulator with his original pivoted detent escapement. And he won the LV Watch Prize for Independent Creatives with that watch. Now, he can only make like 6 to 10 a year out of his house. But the bottom line is a guy with next to no resources, with only a short prior career building and selling his own watches, was able to execute one of the most challenging, delicate, and finicky escapements in the world and in history. And he was able to do it in a wristwatch format, which does not favor detent-style escapements. So if he was able to do this, and with basically no resources, I've got to think that others who've now achieved a level of renown and attention, clients, revenue, certainly enough of a profile that they could bring in an investor or get a bank loan to do some research and development, I would like to see a little bit more ambition, because I feel like there's two types of indies we've seen that have basically run their course. Custom dial jobs, brands that are like micro brands built solely around custom dials and colorful dials and signature dials, and that's all well and good, but I do feel like that was cutting edge 5 years ago, and now that's a very crowded space. And then the other crowded space is the people building with very basic, like Unitas 6498 type movements. And I think it's time for these brands to start showing which ones are going to go the distance and be able to innovate, and then which ones are maybe never going to get out of first gear, so to speak.
Yeah, I think the lack of forward motion is something that is very interesting with some of these independent brands, and they do become a flash in the pan, which is not something that you want to see for something that you appreciate, because there are quite a few of these brands that I appreciate very much, despite, borrowing my own phrase, maybe some of them not having as much to say or logically as others. But the last thing you want as a brand is to be a flash in the pan, because you want to offer your customers a few things. You want to offer your customers the ability to service their watches long term, which, again, if we're working on base level movements, you can find a fantastic watchmaker to do that somewhere. But you want to know that as a consumer, as a customer of a brand, you do want to know that the brand is going to be around to stand behind their product. And if you're a collector, you may want another piece from the brand. You're likely not going to buy two time only pieces that are relatively similar, which is what a lot of these brands are producing. A lot of similar pieces without that forward motion. So stuck in first gear is a great way of putting it, Tim.
Okay, so in terms of New Year's resolutions, I'm going to make a New Year's resolution for Breguet. Breguet, please tell me about the people who are working at Breguet today. So here's a case study, and I'm just going to kind of divorce it from the politics, but Tesla has been a very successful brand. I think that goes without saying. And with essentially no history and a name that had very little meaning to anyone except historians of parascience, they managed to create a $1 trillion brand. No one honestly believes that the cantankerous early 20th century inventor Nikola Tesla is there designing electric cars. The name is purely there as a form of branding. There's no pretense that Tesla's legacy is what defines the cars today. And that total looking askance to history is why they're so successful. So I think the reason they're successful is because the products speak for themselves. But it's also a cold, technologically driven brand, and there's nothing more ephemeral than today's digital device. So where I'm going here is I'm saying that Tesla has proven that no matter how illustrious the name of your company, even if it's a person of world historical importance, you still need to move on and look forward. And I think Abraham Louis Breguet is a great starting point if you want to introduce yourself. But I also think that what we've learned about low-volume artisanal watchmaking is that you need faces of living people to bring these brands to life. And don't overlook the fact that a lot of the interest in independent brands isn't because they're more exclusive or they're newer or they're more savvy with social media or they're the latest thing. All of that has some value, but it's also the sense that you've got a personal awareness of your watchmaker, or in the case of a Richard Mille or a Max Busser or an Edouard Mélon, a face of a real living person whose values are tangible, who's immediately associated with the brand. Now, I don't think you need to create towering figures who may be a risk to leave. That's obviously what you're afraid of, but I also think you're afraid of maybe acknowledging that there is anyone at Breguet other than the long dead master. I would love to know the names of your guillocheurs. I would love to know the names of the people who do your enamel. I would love to know the names of the people who do your skeleton watches and your engraving, because this is how you take a brand that is large and corporate and remote, and you make it human and immediate and endearing, and you can absolutely capture some of that panache and cachet of the indie brands. It's not because they're small, it's not because they're new, it's not because they're super sharp with Instagram and Facebook. It's really just because they're more human, and nothing puts a human face on watchmaking more than knowing the artisans. I think you need to promote them, sign them maybe to long-term contracts so they're not flight risks, but you need to create some modern-day giants and let Abraham Louis Breguet be the opener and not the closer to every discussion of your watch.
I love that idea, and that's something that's so out of the box. I think I wouldn't have thought of that personally, and I think you nailed it. You know, it would be really cool. It would be really cool to know the signature of a guilloche, or it would be really cool to understand why watchmaker X, Y, or Z did X, Y, or Z. And it would be really cool to see kind of the styles of those individual watchmakers through the lens of the brand, because the brand is important. You know, the brand is not going anywhere, but to showcase what the brand currently has going on behind the scenes is a massive idea. That is such a missed opportunity for so many brands. I would challenge every major brand to do something similar. And by major brand, I mean, you know, Holy Trinity level, Breguet level, and above. You know, I think innovation is more interesting when you can anchor it to someone, when you can see someone's philosophy through their mechanical innovation. And oh my gosh, I would love to see that come from a brand. It's also, you know, to your point directly, it's also counter group brand. You know, it's also, it's elevating what makes the brand tick in a way that is not leaning on heritage. It is not leaning on the past quite as much. That's a great way of looking forward and understanding the present. I can't get over that. I love that idea.
And it's important to remember that some very large and successful brands have begun to test these waters already. Patek Philippe requested that Anita Porcher sign her enamel dials. If they're willing to acknowledge someone within their ranks who's not a member of the Stern family on the basis of excellence, just take a look at the credibility they've gained from having Anita Porcher enamel dials at Patek Philippe. The artisan doesn't become bigger than the brand, but the brand becomes a whole lot more human. Or take a look at Louis Vuitton's recent surge into high-end watchmaking, where they're now actively touting the contributions of La Fabrique du Temps watchmakers Enrico Barbacini and Michel Navas with the Daniel Roth revival, saying, look at the quality of the watchmakers that are involved in this revival. They're not worried about these guys becoming bigger than Louis Vuitton, and there's no danger of that. If you've got a strong brand, and Breguet's a strong brand, bring these faces to the fore. It's a huge marketing edge that you're leaving on the table, essentially. This is marketing that costs you almost nothing and could make the difference between where you are now and where you envision yourself being in a few years.
That's such a great point. You know, I'm thinking about other, you know, collaborations like Vianney Halter and Schwartz Etienne, for example. That's a perfect example. Or Carrie Voutilainen and Schwartz Etienne. There's a lot of weight held in the watchmaker, and I think if the brands do that, that's gosh, this is part of why I love doing the show. I love that idea.
Okay, so Armand, what do you have for me?
Oh man, gosh, all right, blank slate. Let's see. Okay, so while we're talking about group brands, I would like to see brands not go so headlong into trends. I would like to see, well, actually, this kind of pairs with that. I would like to see brands stand on their own merit, take risks, discuss new ideas. I think trend complacency is very strong in the industry and probably has been since maybe the mid 70s or early 80s. Kind of that, complacency in following the trends or moving forward with tech. But I think we've reached a boiling point with that. The tech is all there. The tech is continuously being innovated on, and at a certain point, you know, mechanical complications, mechanical force, and mechanical prowess come to a head. And I think new ideas do need to be discussed. And I think a lot of brands are very, very afraid to not follow the trend because they're afraid to fall out of favor in the orological community. They're going to fall out of favor in the market. They're going to fall out of favor just in general. And I think if a couple of brands kind of reach against the tide, so to speak, and kind of, move forward for the sake of innovation, kind of buck trends to a certain degree, I think they would benefit in the long term.
Yeah, I think let's give some examples of what trends are. Huge watches in the 2000s, vintage reeditions in the 2010s, green dials over the last 4 years. The brands, they do have an amazing sort of ability to shadow each other. Even sometimes you worry and wonder how it is that all these brands come out with green dials the same year. It's like, this couldn't have been purely by coincidence. How much looking over the shoulder is being done in the off-season when new models and lines are being planned? So it's the kind of thing where it's really tough to be an innovator. And a great example of an innovator, and I know I don't give them much of a break these days, but you look at 1993 and what the Royal Oak Offshore represented, that was, first of all, perceived as a punch in the face by Gerald Genta, who hated it. But it was a very exciting and dangerous and subversive idea to create this thing that was overwhelmingly huge and brash and almost a grotesque of the Royal Oak, which Audemars Piguet could scarcely afford to undermine an icon so sacrosanct that taking a risk like this was almost to risk the breadwinner, the icon, the symbol of the company. It was something that was genuinely bold, and there was nothing else that came out that year that was even remotely like it. And it was a risk that did not sell well immediately. So the risk didn't pay off instantly, but they persevered with it, and within 2 or 3 years it started gaining momentum, and eventually, of course, they created a Frankenstein's monster. But that's a great example of a company that took absolutely no cues from anyone. If anything, it was a reinterpretation of their own history, but my gosh, that thing hit like the comet that killed the dinosaurs.
And that would shape where we are now. Ultimately, the Royal Oak Offshore kind of personified the luxury sports watch in a way that hadn't been done for quite some time. And that's interesting because, that would then, 10 years or so later lead to the oversized case trend in such a massive way, which would then bleed into kind of, you could make the argument that the oversized case trend kind of made for the rise of RM, which made for the rise of the beach to tux type of timepiece, which made for the rise of the ultimate, the go anywhere, do anything, which I think a lot of collectors are really stuck in right now. And I think part of the brands following the trends is that the collectors follow the trends so fiercely.
Yeah, and unfortunately, people are very suggestible. But I would say a great example in recent years of something that was like nothing else would be, well, at the very high end, something like Haute Rive with the Honoris 1 with the ridiculous 41.6 day power reserve, and the fact that this really doesn't cost that much more than a standard platinum Patek Philippe perpetual calendar. Like it's in a price class alongside, something like a 5236p perpetual calendar. It's in the price class along something like the Daniel Rotary edition, the new Tourbillon Souscription. So to be able to deliver at a price that's comparable to watches of similar stature, something that's completely unprecedented, a 1,000 hour power reserve in a watch that's not the size of a fist or oddly shaped, doesn't need to be wound with a power tool. Like, that's really, really disruptive. I would also say that back in its day, in 2000, the Chanel J12, a full ceramic watch with a full ceramic bracelet, that's an example of just going your own way in a fashion that no one else had ever probed. And it was a shock at the time. And, it became so charismatic and influential that what started as a ceramic watch for women ultimately gave birth to stuff like, the Panerai PAM 438 Tutanero for like the hyper male. It was
full bracelet, the full ceramic,
full
all
bracelet,
everything.
full ceramic, all black. Yeah. And so there are ideas out there. Some things are really bold and forceful, and they don't quite create a trend, but they were worth the effort, like the Corum bubble.
Yeah.
Back in 2005, the Corum bubble, you look at that, you like smack your forehead, you're like, who's going to want that? But it was a success, and it was completely unlike anything else. This was Severin Wunderman saying, well, you know what? What if I made a sapphire that was bigger than the watch itself? And it was a hit. And this is what it means to be an innovator. It means you take risks, and you break away from the trends, and you have to sort of, plow your own furrow, because if you do want to launch a Royal Oak Offshore or a Chanel J12, or you want to launch a Panerai Luminor, something that was just a huge break with what was on the market in the past, you've got to take some risks, and you've got to be willing to fail. And I've only ever heard one executive talk about embracing the lessons and the value of failure, and that was Edouard Mélon of Moser. It's the only time I've ever heard anyone from Switzerland talk about accepting failure for the value of the lessons learned. And he said a large part of that was because he studied and he got his MBA at Wharton. His MBA was right here at the Wharton School of Business in Pennsylvania. And so he got that American perspective on trying, failing, picking yourself up, and coming back stronger. There's a lot of fear of failure culturally in the Swiss watch industry, and I think that's why you rarely do see these real breaks with tradition. I think it's the kind of thing where people are worried that failure will be a career ender, and they've got to get over that.
The fear of the career ender of a failure in the watch industry is funny because, as we've seen, Tim, if you fail at one brand, you can just go to another.
Yeah, well, that's true. And I would also say this, like if you've already got a strong brand, like let's say you're Audemars Piguet today, polar opposite of Audemars Piguet in 1993. Now you are so flush with secure revenue sources and such an institution and really the establishment, you can afford to take some risks. And look, we talk about the lessons learned from incomplete success. I think the Code 1159 carried a lot of lessons learned for AP. And I think if you're AP, I would love to see you revolutionize the dress watch the way you revolutionized the sports watch. Come back with something ultra thin, genuinely elegant. Move the Code 1159 into something along the lines of like an all-arounder. Rather than making that the successor to the Jules Audemars, give us a properly proportioned dress watch that doesn't wear like an oversized sports watch. And I think they could do incredible things. So I guess we've sort of included my resolution for AP into your New Year's resolution of not following trends. Okay, so I've got one for me. This is personal. I want to master two skills. I want to be able to take a problematic automatic chronograph, diagnose it, clean it, oil it, adjust it so it works, and then restaff balances, because those two things, service of an automatic chronograph and restaffing a balance, are substantial portions of the CW21 test for American certified watchmakers. And if I could do those two things and learn those two things over at our workshop that we just built, I feel like I would be well on my way to taking the test, because there's a lot wrapped up in an automatic chronograph. You've got the chronograph, you've got a double calendar, you've got an automatic winding system, you've got a very thick movement with a lot of parts and delicate springs and different lubrication schemes. There's a delicacy necessary to seat that wobbly pinion. If you've ever worked with one of those things, the clutch in a 7750, it's a bizarre wobbling pinion that pivots in a jewel. It doesn't just turn, it bends back and forth. It's kind of weird. But then also staff a balance to cut out the old one, place the new one with a press, rivet it in, and then actually get the watch running again. If I can do those two things, I feel like I will be where I need to be to like take the test in another year or so. And I'm working very slowly on my own, and I don't have a whole lot of support, but I do have a lot of encouragement. So I definitely appreciate that. And I've got sort of like my circle of watchmakers here that are offering me guidance. And if I can get through those two things, I feel like, looking towards a watchmaking certificate will no longer be like a fantasy. It'll be more like a realistic goal with a foreseeable timetable for success. So that's my personal resolution.
I was going to ask what chronograph caliber you were going to start with. I guess 7750 is kind of that low-hanging fruit of a choice.
Yeah, 7750 is on the test no matter what. There's a theory section. There's a service on an automatic chronograph, which they do because it's basically everything you could find in a standard watch all at once. And then there are optional portions like balance staffing is optional, precision timing is optional. I think quartz service is optional. So it's basically a 3-part test, and that third part is sort of the wild card. It's something you choose. And there's also micromechanics. I'm not so ambitious to think I could get into the point where now I can like make a stem, but I've been through a class in balance staffing. You could almost say I audited it. I was in with watchmakers who were genuinely outstanding, and I was just sort of watching. But I did see the whole process, and it's not witchcraft. Whereas I think cutting a functional replica stem in real time requires a lot more equipment and a lot more skill. But the balance staffing, I think, is doable. The 7750 is great movement. You gain a lot of respect when you go through it, especially when you're looking at one that's just a basic SW500 or 7750. You really gain a respect for how precise and thoroughly engineered something we take for granted can be. And it's once you've seen just how sensitive those parts are and how delicately combined they are in such a dense package that you realize even a common watch movement is an extraordinary machine.
It really is. And I'm glad you said that, actually, because I think, in this industry, we see a lot, especially you and I. And I think that sentiment is often lost. We have this, well, if it's not in-house, well, it's not in-house feeling. But, things like the Valjoux 7750, the ETA 2428 or 2492, they're fantastic movements, and they're used as widely as they are for a reason. They're reliable. You could easily make the argument that they're interesting due to the amount of use that they do have. So I think that's a really good point.
So that's sort of my personal New Year's resolution, and yeah, those are important steps forward. And I guarantee you guys, don't think I'm building myself up here. I guarantee you that I'm going to break a bunch of crap in the process of actually getting a repeatable staffing operation locked in. Like, that is a humbling part of working on watches. You break stuff, you lose stuff, things go flying, you realize how little you know. It's a very humbling sort of boot camp experience, and I know because I went through boot camp. So there are days in boot camp where I had to just tell myself I need one victory today. Like, I just need to do one thing right and then hang my hat on that and dwell on that mentally, because there are going to be so many other humiliating beatdowns, emotional, self-esteem, physical, and you just need that one victory a day. And there were days in boot camp when I could tell you the only thing that went right was chow hall procedures for me, which is a whole crazy, type in OCS chow hall procedures online if you want to see what I'm talking about. But maybe the only thing I got right was chow hall procedures. I was not at the front in the runs. I was not the push-up leader. I got called out on inspections. I botched some formality in front of a superior officer. Something went wrong, and it just cascaded into a terrible day. And in watchmaking, you have those terrible days when you're learning. So find one thing you did right. Maybe you black polished and beautifully slotted one screw. Maybe you performed some delicate manual operation successfully. Maybe you lubricated and reassembled a capstone assembly and it was perfect. You dotted the center of the capstone. You put the cup over it. You didn't smear it. It didn't get drawn out to the edge of the cup, where you have to start again. Just one victory. And that's how some days in watchmaking are when you're just learning. And I know that. And I make a lot of mistakes. I'm not a watchmaker. I'm not even close. Don't take me the wrong way, but I am more watch literate and I'm a better authority for explaining watches online than I was before I started tackling watchmaking.
That's good life advice in general. Little victories make the day go by in a meaningful and less and more bearable way.
Yeah, and I am polishing those screws pretty well these days. So I'm going to throw in one more and then I'll swing back to you. But there are two watches I need to wear more. One is my grandfather's graduation. Well, not graduation, it was retirement. His retirement watch from Remington Electric Shaver from 1973. The watch is in great shape. Grandpa took care of it. He did his own watchmaking. He was an incredibly smart, resourceful guy. His kids all went on to be musicians and doctors. And, he had all that horsepower upstairs. He just didn't have the childhood advantages and the education to be a scholar, although he could have been one. But this was a man who could fix anything of any size, of any complexity. So the watch is in great shape. Even the dial is virtually untouched and the hands look new. So that's a testament to how good Grandpa was all the way around with working on things.
And that's an Omega, correct?
It is. It's back from when Seamasters were generally water-resistant watches, and then Seamaster Professionals were dive watches. So this is a DeVille, but it's also Seamaster branded. And it's this lovely little rolled gold watch that was probably the most basic Omega of its day. But even a basic Omega goes the distance, and I need to wear Grandpa's watch more often because it's in great shape, and I know he'd want me to. The other one is a watch I bought for myself, and it was the first watch that I bought after graduating college. This was a graduation watch. Accutron Caliber 214 Spaceview, 1974, Swiss made. And really all it needs is a battery. But what I would like to do is get the old transistor swapped out, because the original battery for this, I want to say it would have been like a 1.35 volt mercury cell battery that's no longer made for environmental and health reasons. And I think right now all the batteries are like 1.5, 1.55 volts. So it runs, but when you put a modern battery in it, it runs fast. And this watch should run like 1 second a day. So I need to just get it up and running again for morale, and then find someone who's really state of the art with microelectronics repair to swap out that transistor for one that will offer. Actually, I don't think it's a transistor. I think it's the resistor specifically. There is a transistor, but I think it's the resistor that needs to be swapped out to get the thing to run right with a modern battery. So two watches, two veterans, both from the 70s, ironically, that I need to get back into my rotation.
That transitions really well into my final resolution. And this is something that I've said before, and I've said it a lot, but living in one's collection overall, make the watch you haven't take the watch that you haven't worn in months and take it for a spin for a week or two. Make yourself go through the span of your collection. I personally need to do this. I've mentioned here or there, I have a big Seiko collection. I have a few vintage Omegas, one of which is my grandfather's as well. I've got a couple of Cartiers that are, in my wife's jewelry box, but I really need to scroll through my collection and wear a little bit of everything. It's fun. It gives you variety. And above all, it gives you an appreciation for what you currently have. We've gotten into this what have you acquired lately society. And I think, there's something to be said for tried and true. I have a Seiko Orange Monster that I bought 15 years ago at this point, maybe. And that watch is incredible. It's on an orange NATO strap. It's a steel case. It's an orange dial. It's so much fun to wear. And if it were not in a watch box, there would be dust on it. And that's a shame. I really like that watch. I have a lot of really good memories in that watch. So I am going to do a very similar thing and span through my collection. I don't know that, my Daytona or GMT will see a week without wear ever. But I think making it a point to put these things on your wrist, and not just for one day, not just for one outfit, not just for one occurrence, but do it regularly and do it for a couple of days here and there. It is important, because why else do we collect? Otherwise we're accumulators and we don't enjoy the collection that we've spanned. So I echo that, and I totally agree, Tim.
Yeah. So, it's like Sheryl Crow saying, it's not having what you want, it's wanting what you've got. And that's definitely tough to do when so many incredible things seem to be within reach in the watch space. One click on Chrono24, one bid on eBay, one retirement postponing decision at a dealer, and it's very difficult to be tempted. And I know I sell these things for a living, and I see everything hands-on every day, so it really is a great thing to love the watches you've got, and I'm going to do a better job of keeping them in the rotation next year. So
Watches are endless, and our time to enjoy them is certainly not. So
that's a really good point, definitely. And you can live for today without forsaking tomorrow. Enjoy your watches. So Jerome Lambert, coming down from a corporate level executive role at Richemont back to the ship he led from about 2003 to 2013 or 2002 to 2013 at JLC, Jerome Lambert oversaw what's now regarded as a golden era as the CEO of the company through the era of the Amvox watches, the Duomet, the Master Compressors, the Navy SEALs, watches that pushed the limits of engineering and broke new, I think, thresholds in terms of complication for money, perpetual calendar alarms, tourbillon GMTs and steel cases, things that had not been done before, and really fully justified the company's historic reputation as the watchmaker's watchmaker and as an engineering and innovation leader. It's very difficult to go home again. I'm not going to say you can't go home again because, I mean, Carlos Santana had one hell of a comeback back in the 90s, so it can be done, but you want to be Carlos Santana, not Lance Armstrong, if you know what I mean. So Jerome Lambert is back at the head of JLC, and I cannot imagine surpassing the achievements of his prior career there. I think what the company needs is exciting products, complications at accessible prices again, and new things. The company has coasted for a long time on fundamentals from the Lambert era. The Duomets got their first refresh this year since they were launched in 2007, and frankly, it was a little bit underwhelming. There's a lot of simple calendars in the catalog that are priced at relatively high premiums because of the JLC name, but they have no more capability than a calendar from Oris. I don't know why JLC doesn't have an annual calendar. Why do I have to choose between a perpetual and a simple calendar? I really don't know why the compressor keys went away. They were a brilliant solution to a functional water-resistant watch. I don't understand why very little progress has been made on alarm watches, despite the fact that JLC came out with its first one in 1950. Why is it that we're looking at companies like Breguet and Patek Philippe and Glasuta Original to execute all the innovation in the alarm watch category? JLC, where is my Senator Diary competitor? Where is my Reverso Memovox? Where is my, where is my chronograph alarm? Let's combine some of these things that we know you do well to create watches that are in the spirit of those watches of the 2000s, which always gave you a lot of complication, but at very fair prices. It was almost like Patek Philippe complications at Jaeger-LeCoultre prices, and that was really the hallmark of the 2000s. Amvox, the best ever car-themed watch collection because every single design was a clean slate. Instead of just saying, oh, well, we'll take the master calendar and put a wing on the dial. It was completely clean slate. Magali Maitre, she was an incredible designer. She did almost all the men's watches of the period. And, for that matter, the Extreme Lab series, we haven't seen a new installment since 2014. It's time. So I would love to see JLC jump back out into that position of being an innovation and complication leader at prices that are JLC prices, not, Longa, Patek, Top, and Vacheron, because we've still seen monster complications from JLC this last decade, but in almost every case, they've been six-figure watches that are interchangeable with the kind of watches that Patek and Grubel 4C and Debetune and Urwerk and others who play in that premier echelon are building. I think JLC needs to undercut those brands with stuff that's just as capable for less money. Something that the average man could dream of making happen as opposed to just dream about. So JLC, Jerome Lambert, I want this to be the most fruitful of reunions, and I would love to see a return to innovation and risk-taking, because that's another thing we've seen since Lambert left. the 2000s were characterized mostly by a bunch of vintage reeditions. We had a tribute to geophysics. We had reverso tributes. I get it. Enough with the tributes. Maybe now it's time for something completely fresh, and I think he's the right man for the job. I'm just crossing my fingers because there's a million ways this could go wrong. It's very difficult, as they say, to go home again.
Theme of this show, I think, could easily be forward motion, and I think you nailed it with that.
Okay, another thing. Glasuta Original, any kind of advertising, please, just let me know you're alive. Just ring the bell. Let me know you're out there. And personally, I will attend and cover Watches and Wonders in depth this year. I've been to Dubai Watch Week. I've attended Watch Time New York as a spectator, but I haven't done one of the big Swiss trade shows since SIHH in 2019. Of course, that was the before times. I will be there with my full crew. We're going to be doing new products and hands-on every single day. We're going to be focused on the hardware, not bloviating brand representatives, so tune in and you will get the latest. So come spring, you can look for me at Watches and Wonders, and I will be back on track with the big trade shows. For the last time this year, where can folks find us?
For the last time in 2024, you can find me on Instagram at It's Me Armand. You can find me on our YouTube channel from time to time, and you can find me at Armand at the1916company.com for email.
And I am Tim_Masso. See my 1-minute reviews as well as little close clips and vignettes of my holiday at home at Tim_Masso. Until then, happy holidays, and may you have a safe and prosperous new year. Time out.